Other prisoners joined in the derision, emboldened by Weiss's mockery. Some of them slapped the blankets against their thighs as though testing the fabric for some quality it obviously lacked, while others made jokes about using them to polish their already scuffed boots or perhaps as rags for cleaning the barracks floor. The laughter grew louder and more confident, filling the space with a sound that was equal parts amusement and bitterness. These were men who had marched through frozen steppes and alpine passes, who had wrapped themselves in thick wool blankets that weighed heavy in their packs but kept the cold at bay during the brutal European winters they had endured. To them, weight meant quality, and heaviness signified durability. The idea that this thin, almost translucent material could serve any useful purpose against the cold struck them as absurd, a confirmation of what they had been told about America, that it was a nation of abundance, perhaps, but shallow abundance, built on cheap mass production and inferior substitutes for the real thing. Their laughter was not just about the blankets themselves, though the blankets were certainly inadequate in their eyes, but about what the blankets represented to them, proof that the Americans, for all their wealth and resources, did not understand the fundamentals of survival, did not grasp what it meant to endure real hardship. What none of these men understood as they stood there mocking the thin fabric was that they were about to receive an education in exactly how wrong their assumptions could be. Outside the barracks, beyond the wooden walls that offered only minimal protection from the elements, weather patterns were shifting in ways that the prisoners could not see or anticipate. A cold front was moving down from the northern plains, pushed by winds that had gathered strength over hundreds of miles of open territory. The temperature, which had been merely cool when they arrived, was dropping steadily as the sun sank below the horizon, and by the time darkness fully settled over the camp, it would be colder than any of these men had expected to experience in Texas, a place they had imagined would be warm and dry, more like North Africa than the frozen landscapes they had left behind in Europe. The guards who handed out the blankets showed no reaction to the prisoners' laughter and derision. They had seen this before, convoy after convoy of captured enemy soldiers arriving at camps scattered across the American heartland, and they had long since stopped being surprised by the attitudes these men brought with them. To the guards, the distribution of blankets was simply another routine task in a long list of duties, another shipment of supplies from the vast network of warehouses and factories that kept the American military machine running at a scale the prisoners could not begin to imagine. The scene, viewed from a distance, might have seemed almost comical in its absurdity. Here were soldiers of what had once been called the master race, proud warriors of a regime that had conquered most of Europe and proclaimed itself destined to rule the world for 1,000 years, and they were standing in a prisoner of war camp in Texas, laughing at blankets. The irony was already forming, though none of them recognized it yet. Within just a few hours, those same blankets that they dismissed as worthless rags would become the most important objects in their immediate world, the thin barrier between survival and suffering, between warmth and a cold that could kill a man if he was exposed to it long enough without protection. The stage was being set for a revelation that would shake not just their physical comfort, but their entire understanding of themselves and their enemy, and the transformation would begin as soon as the sun finished its descent, and the Texas night revealed its true nature. As the evening wore on and the prisoners settled into their new accommodations, the conversation inevitably turned to comparisons between what they had left behind and what they found here. The German military, particularly among its officer class, had always prided itself on maintaining certain standards, certain traditions that went back generations. Their equipment was supposed to be the best, manufactured to exacting specifications by craftsmen who understood their trade. The blankets they had used in their own barracks back home in Germany, in cities like Munich and Dresden, in towns scattered throughout Bavaria and Saxony and the Rhineland, those blankets had been thick and heavy, woven from wool that came from sheep raised in the highlands, wool that retained its warmth even when damp, that could be folded and stacked to create barriers against drafts that crept through the stone walls of old military installations. Major Dieter Kraus, who before his capture had served as quartermaster for a regiment stationed near Munich, took it upon himself to educate his fellow prisoners about the proper specifications for military bedding. He spoke with the authority of a man who had spent years managing supplies and equipment, and his voice carried through the barracks as he described how a proper German military blanket weighed nearly 5 kilograms when dry, how the thickness of the weave could block drafts from even the oldest and most poorly maintained buildings, how a soldier could wrap himself twice in such a blanket and still have material left over. His words drew nods of agreement from the men around him, because this was a story they knew, a narrative that confirmed what they wanted to believe about themselves and their superiority. Lieutenant Weiss, warming to the subject, added his own observations about how in the camps and barracks where he had trained and served before being sent to North Africa, the winters had been brutal enough that even with those thick wool blankets, even wrapped in layers of heavy fabric, a man could still feel the bite of January cold seeping through to his bones. The implication was clear. If German blankets, which were obviously superior in every way, barely sufficed to keep men warm during European winters, what hope did these flimsy American sheets have against any real cold? The whole situation struck them as further evidence of American incompetence, or perhaps American arrogance, the kind of thinking that assumed throwing money and mass production at a problem could substitute for genuine quality and craftsmanship. Some of them had heard stories about American abundance, about factories that could produce goods in quantities that German industry could never match, but they interpreted this not as strength but as waste, as the kind of excessive consumption that came from a society that valued quantity over quality, that had no real understanding of scarcity or the need to make things that would last. The conversation continued in this vein for quite some time, with various prisoners contributing their own memories and anecdotes, each story reinforcing the collective belief that they were superior to their captors in every way that mattered. One sergeant, a man named Otto Reis, who had survived the brutal fighting on the Eastern Front before being transferred to North Africa, where he was eventually captured, told a story about how his unit had once marched with supply carts so heavily loaded with blankets and winter gear that the horses pulling them had struggled under the weight, their breath coming in great clouds of steam as they laboured through snow that came up to their bellies. The men in his unit had still frozen during that march, Reis recalled with a grim smile, because the Russian winter was merciless and no amount of wool could completely protect a man from it. But at least they had proper equipment, at least they had blankets that met the standard expected of a professional military force. The story drew appreciative laughter from his audience because it confirmed what they all wanted to believe, that their suffering had been noble suffering, that their hardships had been endured with proper equipment and discipline, unlike these Americans who apparently thought a thin sheet of cotton or whatever this material was could serve the same purpose. But underneath all the bravado and mockery, underneath the laughter and the competitive storytelling, there was something else stirring in the barracks that evening, a subtle unease that none of them wanted to acknowledge openly. The temperature was continuing to drop, and even inside the wooden building, even with all the bodies generating heat in the enclosed space, the air was getting noticeably colder. Drafts were finding their way through gaps in the walls, through spaces between the floorboards, carrying with them the sharp bite of the wind that was building outside. Men who had been sitting casually on their bunks began to shift their positions, pulling their thin uniform jackets tighter around their shoulders, rubbing their hands together for warmth. The barracks, which had seemed adequate when they first arrived in the late afternoon sunlight, was revealing itself to be much less substantial than the stone buildings they were accustomed to in Europe. The wood, while relatively new and well constructed by the standards of a temporary military facility, offered nowhere near the insulation that thick stone walls provided, and as the night deepened and the cold intensified, this difference was becoming increasingly apparent to everyone in the room. By the time the oil lamps were dimmed for the night, the jovial atmosphere had faded somewhat, replaced by a quieter mood as men prepared to sleep. They climbed into their bunks, still wearing most of their clothing because the cold was unmistakable now, and they pulled those thin American blankets over themselves with varying degrees of reluctance and skepticism. Some of them bundled the blankets into balls and used them as pillows, preferring to rely on their body heat and their uniforms for warmth rather than trust the despised fabric. Others spread the blankets out but layered them with their jackets or any other piece of cloth they could find, trying to create some additional thickness and insulation. Very few of them actually trusted the blankets to do the job they were designed for, and most expected to spend a miserable night shivering and cursing the Americans for their inadequate provisions. The lights went out completely, plunging the barracks into a darkness broken only by the faint starlight that filtered through the windows, and the building settled into the sounds of men trying to find comfortable positions on hard bunks, the creak of wood and the rustle of fabric, and the occasional cough or muttered curse in German. Outside, the wind was picking up strength, gathering momentum as it swept across the open prairie with nothing to slow it down or break its force. The sound of it was constant now, a low howl that rose and fell but never quite disappeared, and it pressed against the barracks walls with a physical force that made the entire structure groan and shift slightly on its foundation. The cold front that had been approaching all evening had fully arrived, and the temperature was plummeting far below what anyone had anticipated for this time of year in this part of Texas. It was an unusual weather pattern, the kind of freak occurrence that happens perhaps once in a decade, when Arctic air manages to push this far south and collide with the normally moderate climate of central Texas. The result was a night that would have been dangerous even for men who were well prepared and properly equipped, and these prisoners, despite all their military experience and their pride in their own toughness, were neither well prepared nor properly equipped by their own estimation, because they had dismissed the only protection offered to them as worthless trash not fit for cleaning rags. The first hour after lights out passed in restless discomfort as the cold continued its relentless advance into every corner of the barracks. Men who had initially tried to tough it out without using their blankets soon found themselves reaching for them after all, swallowing their pride in the face of physical necessity. The human body can only generate so much heat, and when the surrounding air is actively pulling that heat away through convection, and the wood beneath you is acting as a heat sink drawing warmth from your body, pride becomes a luxury that quickly loses its appeal. Lieutenant Carl Weiss, who had been among the most vocal in his contempt for the American blankets, found himself pulling the thin fabric up to his chin despite his earlier declarations. He could feel the cold pressing against him like a physical weight, trying to force its way through his clothing and steal the heat from his core. And he discovered to his surprise that the despised blanket was actually doing something to counter this assault. The weave, thin as it appeared, was trapping air close to his body, and that trapped air was being warmed by his own body heat, creating a layer of insulation that was noticeably better than nothing at all. All around the barracks, similar discoveries were being made in silence, each man coming to realize individually that perhaps they had been too hasty in their judgment, but none of them willing to admit this out loud where others might hear. Sergeant Otto Rice wrapped himself completely in his blanket, tucking the edges carefully under his shoulders and around his feet to eliminate any gaps where cold air might creep in, and he found that this configuration, despite the thinness of the material, actually created a surprisingly effective barrier against the cold. His fingers, which had been growing numb, began to warm slightly as blood flow improved. His breathing, which had been producing great visible clouds of condensation in the frigid air, seemed to warm a bit as the space under the blanket retained more of his body heat. He lay very still, not wanting to disturb the delicate equilibrium he had achieved, and he tried very hard not to think about the fact that his survival at this moment depended entirely on a piece of cloth he had mocked just a few hours earlier. From the far end of the barracks came a sound that cut through the constant background noise of wind and creaking wood, a groan that carried notes of genuine distress. It was a young prisoner, barely more than a boy really, a private named Hans Keller, who had been conscripted near the end and sent to North Africa with minimal training, where he was captured almost immediately in one of the final engagements of that campaign. His voice, shaking with cold and perhaps with fear, announced to anyone who might be listening that he could no longer feel his fingers, that the numbness had spread from his fingertips up into his hands, and he was starting to worry that he might be getting frostbite. The silence that followed his words was heavy with implications, because frostbite was a serious matter, something that could lead to permanent injury or even amputation if not addressed. And here they were in a prisoner of war camp with limited medical facilities and no way to demand better treatment. Two of the prisoners nearest to young Keller made a decision in that moment that put basic human compassion ahead of their pride and their ideology. They climbed out of their own bunks, bringing their blankets with them, and they pressed their bodies close to Keller on either side, creating a sandwich of shared body heat. All three of them pulled their American-issued blankets over the huddle they had formed, and slowly, gradually, the combined warmth of three bodies in close proximity began to drive back the cold that had been threatening to cause real damage. The night wore on with agonizing slowness, each hour feeling like several as the prisoners lay in their bunks trying to sleep but finding rest elusive in the face of such cold. Outside, the frost was forming on every exposed surface, coating the ground and the fence posts and the guard towers in a layer of white crystals that glittered in the starlight. The guards themselves, Americans who were presumably better equipped for this weather than the prisoners were, had retreated to their own heated quarters, except for the few unlucky souls assigned to maintain a watch through the night, and even those men were bundled in heavy coats and stamping their feet regularly to maintain circulation. Inside the barracks, the temperature had dropped to the point where breath was visible as thick white fog, where the metal frames of the bunks were cold enough to burn skin if touched directly, where any exposed skin quickly became painfully cold. And yet, somehow, the men endured. The thin blankets that had seemed so inadequate, that had been the subject of such scorn and mockery, were performing their function with a quiet efficiency that was beginning to command a grudging respect from men who were running out of other options. When dawn finally arrived, creeping slowly across the Texas prairie and bringing with it a pale sun that offered light but precious little warmth, the scene inside the barracks was one of exhausted survival. The men who stirred from their bunks moved stiffly, their joints protesting the hours of cold and the hard surfaces they had been lying on. They rubbed their arms and stamped their feet, trying to restore full circulation and feeling to extremities that had spent the night on the edge of numbness. The air in the barracks was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and the moisture from their collective breathing, and frost had actually formed on the inside of some of the windows where condensation had frozen against the glass. But despite the misery of the night just past, despite the cold that had tested them in ways they had not expected, every single man in that barracks was alive and relatively intact. There had been no deaths from exposure, no cases of severe frostbite that would require amputation, no medical emergencies beyond some minor discomfort and a lot of bruised egos. The blankets, those thin and mocked pieces of American manufacturing, had done their job. Outside, the ground was covered in a layer of frost so thick it looked almost like snow, the white coating extending as far as the eye could see across the flat Texas landscape. It was proof, visible and undeniable, of just how cold the night had been, cold enough to kill men who were not protected, cold enough to cause serious injury to anyone caught outside without adequate shelter and covering. The irony of the situation was not lost on the prisoners as they looked out the windows at this evidence of the night they had survived. They had spent the evening laughing at the blankets, dismissing them as worthless, mocking the Americans for providing such inadequate gear, and then those same blankets had kept them alive through a night that could easily have been fatal. The cognitive dissonance this created was profound and deeply uncomfortable, because it forced them to confront the possibility that their assumptions about American inferiority might be wrong, that there might be things the enemy understood better than they did, that their pride and their confidence in their own superiority might be based on incomplete information and biased thinking. The morning routine began slowly that day, with men moving through their tasks in a subdued manner that contrasted sharply with the boisterous confidence of the previous evening. Breakfast was distributed by the guards, simple fare but hot and substantial, and the prisoners accepted it with quiet gratitude that would have seemed unthinkable just 12 hours earlier. As they ate, conversations began to develop, quiet discussions that circled around the events of the night without directly addressing the elephant in the room. Some men tried to maintain their position, arguing that the cold had not been that bad really, that they had endured worse in Russia or in the Alps, that this was nothing compared to what a real European winter could throw at a man. But these protestations rang hollow even to those making them, because everyone in that barracks knew the truth, knew that without those thin American blankets, the night would have gone very differently, and not everyone might have seen the morning sun. It was around this time that some information began to filter into the camp through the guards, casual comments made during routine interactions that nevertheless carried enormous implications for the prisoners who heard them. Captain Walter Mills, the American officer responsible for overseeing supply distribution to the camp, mentioned to one of his sergeants within earshot of several German prisoners that the blankets they had been issued were not actually made from wool at all, but rather from a synthetic blend of fibers that had been developed and perfected in American factories specifically for military use. The materials included rayon and other man-made substances that had been engineered at the molecular level to provide maximum insulation with minimum weight. Unlike natural wool, which required raising sheep and processing their fleece through a labor-intensive series of steps, these synthetic blankets could be manufactured in vast quantities using industrial processes that ran around the clock. Captain Mills went on to mention, almost as an afterthought, that a single factory in Massachusetts was currently producing more than 250,000 of these blankets every single month, while warehouses scattered throughout the Midwest were shipping carloads of them daily by rail to military bases and prisoner-of-war camps all across the continental United States. The numbers hit the German prisoners like physical blows, stunning them into silence as they tried to process the implications. 250,000 blankets from just one factory, every single month. The scale of production was simply beyond anything they had experienced in Germany, where even during the peak of wartime mobilization, even when every factory was converted to military production and every resource was dedicated to the war effort, they had never achieved anything remotely approaching such output in textile production. And this was just blankets, just one small piece of the vast supply apparatus that was keeping the American military machine fed and equipped and sheltered. If the Americans could produce blankets in such quantities that they could afford to give them freely to prisoners of war, what did that say about their overall industrial capacity? What did it imply about their ability to produce ammunition and vehicles and aircraft and all the other materiel that modern warfare required? These were uncomfortable questions that many of the prisoners would rather not have contemplated, because the answers suggested that the war they had been fighting was even more hopeless than they had realized, that Germany had been outmatched not just tactically or strategically, but at a fundamental economic level that made victory impossible from the start. The news spread through the camp like wildfire, passed from prisoner to prisoner in whispered conversations and growing speculation. Major Dieter Kraus, who had been so confident in his pronouncements about German superiority in blanket manufacturing, found himself confronted with a reality that contradicted everything he thought he knew. He muttered to a small group of fellow officers that even during peacetime, when German industry was operating at full capacity without the disruptions of Allied bombing or resource shortages, they had never come close to achieving the kind of production numbers the Americans were apparently treating as routine. The contrast was brutal and humiliating. In Germany, by late 1943, wool was being strictly rationed, stripped from civilian coats and recycled from old uniforms to provide even minimal supplies for the troops fighting in the East. Women were being asked to donate their winter clothing, children were going without proper coats, and still there was not enough to go around. Yet here in America, in a country that was fighting a two-front war across both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, there was such abundance that prisoners, captured enemy soldiers, were being provided with brand new blankets that had been manufactured specifically for them using advanced materials and processes that German industry could not replicate. One prisoner, a man who had kept a small notebook hidden from the guards and used it to record his observations and thoughts during his captivity, wrote an entry that night which would later be confiscated when the notebooks were discovered during a routine search of the barracks. His words captured the profound sense of disorientation that was sweeping through the camp. He wrote that the experience had unsettled him more deeply than any battlefield defeat, more profoundly than the moment of his capture or the realization that Germany was losing the war. On the battlefield, defeat could be explained by tactical errors or bad luck or superior numbers on the enemy side. But this abundance of resources, this casual demonstration of industrial might that could afford to be generous even to its enemies, this suggested a level of superiority that went beyond mere military strength. If they can afford to clothe their prisoners so well, he had written in his cramped handwriting, what must they be giving to their own soldiers? What kind of supplies are American troops receiving if this is what they give to us? The implications were staggering and deeply threatening to the entire worldview that had sustained these men through years of combat and hardship. As the day progressed and more details emerged, the prisoners learned additional facts that only reinforced their growing sense of being comprehensively outmatched. A corporal who had been working on a cleanup detail near the rail line returned with a report that he had seen a train, an entire freight train composed of dozens of cars, loaded with nothing but crates of blankets being transported west toward another prisoner of war camp somewhere in California or Oregon. The sheer volume of material represented by that train, the casual abundance it demonstrated, was almost incomprehensible to men who came from a country where every thread and fibre was accounted for and rationed. Another prisoner overheard guards discussing how American families were donating quilts through the Red Cross, thousands and thousands of parcels arriving with clockwork precision from homes across America, sent to support the war effort, and to ensure that even prisoners of war were treated humanely according to the Geneva Conventions. These quilts were coming from families who themselves were living under rationing, who were making sacrifices and doing without certain luxuries to support the troops, and yet they still had enough surplus comfort and security to send handmade blankets to enemy soldiers being held in camps on American soil. The psychological impact of this realization was profound and multi-layered. These were men who had been taught from childhood about German superiority, about the master race and the 1,000-year realm that was supposed to arise from their victories. They had been told that other peoples, particularly Americans with their mixed population and democratic chaos, were inherently inferior, weak, decadent, corrupted by ease and luxury. And now they were confronting evidence that suggested exactly the opposite, that American society was so robust, so wealthy, so industrially powerful that it could fight a global war on multiple fronts while still maintaining a standard of living that allowed its citizens to donate comfort items to prisoners. The cognitive dissonance this created was almost painful, forcing a re-evaluation of assumptions that had been fundamental to their identity and their understanding of the world. Some of the prisoners resisted this re-evaluation, clinging stubbornly to their old beliefs and insisting that what they were seeing was propaganda, that the Americans were deliberately showing off to demoralize them, that this abundance was somehow false or temporary or achieved through methods that would ultimately prove unsustainable. But for others, particularly the younger prisoners who had not been as thoroughly indoctrinated or who had already been harboring private doubts about the things they had been told, the evidence was too overwhelming to dismiss. The thin blanket was no longer just a piece of cloth. It had become a symbol, a physical manifestation of American power that operated on principles different from what they had been taught to expect. It represented innovation over tradition, efficiency over mere weight, the triumph of engineering and industrial organization over the old European assumption that quality must always mean heaviness and permanence. The blanket's very lightness, which they had mocked, was actually evidence of sophisticated materials, science, and manufacturing processes that Germany simply could not match. The fact that millions of these blankets could be produced and distributed efficiently across a continent-sized country, meeting the needs of both military and civilian populations while still having enough left over for prisoners, demonstrated a level of economic organization and industrial capacity that was frankly terrifying when you thought about its implications for the war effort as a whole. As afternoon faded toward evening and the prospect of another cold night approached, the mood in the barracks had shifted dramatically from what it had been just 24 hours earlier. There was no laughter now, no mockery or contemptuous jokes about American incompetence. Instead, there was a quiet tension, an unspoken acknowledgement that they had been wrong and that their wrongness had nearly cost them dearly. The guards began their evening distribution of supplies, and this time when they handed out extra blankets, explaining that the cold weather was expected to persist for several more days, the prisoners accepted them with gratitude instead of scorn. Some of the men examined the blankets more closely now, running their fingers over the weave, feeling the texture of the synthetic fibers, trying to understand through touch what their minds were still struggling to accept intellectually. The material was indeed thin and light. There was no denying that objective fact, but it worked, and in the final analysis that was all that really mattered. It functioned as advertised, performing its role with an efficiency that their heavy wool blankets had never quite achieved, despite all their weight and bulk. Night fell again, and this time the prisoners were better prepared psychologically, if not materially, for what awaited them. The temperature dropped just as sharply as it had the night before, the cold front having settled over the region like a heavy blanket of its own, and the wind continued its relentless assault on the wooden walls of the barracks. But now the men knew what to do, knew how to arrange their blankets to maximum effect, knew to tuck the edges carefully to prevent drafts, knew to layer their clothing in ways that would trap the most warmth. They settled into their bunks with the grim determination of soldiers preparing for a long siege, and though the night was no less uncomfortable than the previous one had been, there was less panic, less fear, less uncertainty. They had survived one night and they would survive this one, and the blankets that they had ridiculed would once again be the tools of their survival. Some of the men, as they lay in the darkness waiting for sleep to come, found their thoughts turning to broader questions about the war and their place in it, questions that had been easier to avoid when they could still believe in their own fundamental superiority over the enemy. When morning came again, cold and bright, the prisoners emerged from their barracks to find that additional supplies had arrived overnight. A wagon had pulled into the camp while they slept, carrying a load of quilts that had been donated by townspeople from the surrounding area. These were not military-issue blankets, but rather handmade items, each one unique, stitched together by the hands of American civilians who had taken the time and effort to create something specifically intended to provide comfort to people in need. The fact that those people in need were German prisoners of war, enemy soldiers who had fought to destroy everything America stood for, made the gesture even more remarkable and harder to understand for men whose entire worldview had been built around concepts of racial hierarchy and natural enmity between peoples. Among the quilts was one that caught the attention of a former tank officer from Hamburg, a man who had commanded a unit in North Africa before his vehicle was destroyed and his crew captured. This particular quilt was edged with delicate embroidery, the kind of careful needlework that suggested it had been made by a child, and the pattern included flowers and stars and other innocent designs that spoke of domestic peace and family comfort. He held this quilt in his hands, this gift from an unknown American family to an unknown German prisoner, and he traced the small stitches with fingers that had once operated the controls of a machine designed to kill American soldiers. And something in him broke in that moment, some final barrier of resistance against the truth that was forcing itself upon him. The distribution of these donated quilts created a profound emotional impact throughout the camp, sparking conversations that went far beyond mere commentary on the weather or the adequacy of supplies. Some prisoners whispered that this must be a trick, a calculated attempt by the Americans to soften them up, to make them more cooperative or compliant by showing them kindness that they did not deserve and had not earned. But this explanation felt increasingly hollow as more and more evidence accumulated of genuine care and concern on the part of their captors. The guards were not cruel or vindictive. They did not abuse their authority or take revenge for the deaths of American soldiers killed by German forces. Instead, they maintained a professional distance while ensuring that the basic needs of their prisoners were met, and sometimes they went beyond the basic requirements of the Geneva Conventions to provide small comforts and kindnesses that spoke to a fundamental decency that transcended the categories of friend and enemy. When an American sergeant noticed a young German prisoner coughing violently one morning, struggling to catch his breath in the cold air, he did not hesitate or ask for permission or check regulations. He simply walked over, removed a second blanket from a supply stack, and draped it over the prisoner's shoulders without a word, as casually as if he were helping a friend or family member. The German prisoner, caught completely off guard by this unexpected act of human kindness, could only stare in stunned silence, his mind unable to reconcile the gesture with everything he had been taught about Americans and their supposed moral inferiority. That evening, as the men gathered in their barracks after another day of routine camp activities, the conversations turned philosophical in ways that would have been unthinkable just a few days earlier. Major Krauss, who had been among the most vocal in proclaiming German superiority, spoke quietly to Lieutenant Weiss in a corner of the room where they thought they would not be overheard. He admitted, with obvious difficulty and reluctance, that the Americans could have let them freeze if they had wanted to, could have provided minimal shelter and inadequate blankets, and simply shrugged when prisoners died from exposure, claiming that they had met the letter, if not the spirit of their obligations under international law. Instead, they had provided blankets that worked better than German wool, had distributed extra supplies when the weather turned dangerous, had even supplemented military-issue items with donations from civilian families who owed the prisoners nothing and had every reason to hate them. "This is something I cannot explain," Krauss said softly, his words carrying the weight of a world-view crumbling under the pressure of reality. "It does not fit with what I was taught, what I believed about these people. If they are supposed to be weak and decadent, why do they show such strength in their mercy? If they are supposed to be our inferiors, why do they surpass us in this basic humanity?" His questions hung in the air unanswered, because Lieutenant Weiss had no answers to give, having been wrestling with similar doubts himself. The thin American blanket had become more than just a piece of textile for these men. It had transformed into a bridge, fragile and unexpected, that connected enemy to enemy across the gulf of war and ideology. It reminded them, in ways that no propaganda or lecture could ever achieve, that warfare was conducted between governments and armies and ideological systems, but survival and suffering and basic human compassion existed at a different level entirely, a level where the categories of us and them became less clear and less important. Some of the prisoners, particularly those who had maintained personal diaries or who would later write memoirs about their experiences in captivity, recorded their memories of this period with a mixture of shame and gratitude, shame at how quickly they had judged and dismissed something they did not understand, and gratitude that their captors had been wise enough and generous enough to provide protection even to men who had shown no appreciation or recognition of that generosity until forced to do so by circumstances. The days stretched into weeks, and the weeks into months, as winter gradually loosened its grip on central Texas and gave way to the milder temperatures of early spring. The acute crisis of those first freezing nights faded into memory, but the lessons learned during that time did not fade with it. The prisoners fell into the routines of camp life, working on assigned tasks, writing letters home when permitted, playing cards or reading books in their spare time. But through all of these activities, the memory of the blankets persisted. Some men folded their blankets with ritual care each morning, treating them with a respect that would have seemed absurd in those first moments when they arrived at the camp. Others kept their blankets close even when the weather no longer required it, tucking them under their heads as pillows or draping them over their shoulders during evening conversations, maintaining a physical connection to these objects that had saved their lives. The thin cloth had become a talisman of sorts, a reminder of truths that were uncomfortable but undeniable, truths about American power and efficiency, truths about the hollowness of the ideology they had fought for, truths about the possibility of human decency even between enemies. By the time spring of 1945 arrived and news began filtering into the camps about Germany's final collapse, about Soviet armies closing in on Berlin from the east and American and British forces advancing from the west, the German prisoners in Texas had already begun the psychological process of rebuilding their understanding of the world. The final surrender, when it came in May, was both shocking and inevitable, the end of everything they had fought for and believed in, and yet also a relief because it meant the killing would stop and they could begin thinking about returning home to whatever remained of their former lives. Repatriation was a slow and bureaucratic process, involving mountains of paperwork and long delays as the Allies sorted through millions of prisoners and displaced persons scattered across Europe and America. But eventually the day came when the men of this particular camp in Texas were told to gather their few permitted possessions and prepare for transport to a port where they would board ships for the journey back across the Atlantic. Among those permitted possessions, each prisoner was allowed to keep certain small personal items, and many of them, when faced with the decision of what to take from their months or years in captivity, chose to keep their American-issued blankets. The guards and officers who oversaw this final inventory found it curious and somewhat touching that so many of the Germans wanted to bring these blankets home with them. After all, they were just cheap military surplus, mass-produced items that had no monetary value and certainly no aesthetic appeal. But to the prisoners who carried them onto the trains that would take them to the coast, these blankets represented something far more significant than their material worth. They were physical evidence of survival, tangible proof that they had endured and that unlikely objects provided by an unlikely source had been instrumental in that endurance. Some of them, when questioned about why they wanted to keep such ordinary items, struggled to articulate their reasons, falling back on simple statements like, "It saved my life," or "I want to remember," without fully explaining what it was they wanted to remember, or why it seemed so important to preserve this particular memory among all the others they carried with them. One young prisoner, Hans Keller, that same private who had nearly succumbed to frostbite during that first terrible night, made the journey home to Bremen carrying a blanket that had been patched with pieces of fabric from one of those donated American quilts, creating a hybrid object that combined official military issue with civilian charity. When he finally arrived at the ruins of his family home, finding his mother alive against all odds in a city that had been devastated by years of Allied bombing, he showed her the blanket with hands that trembled slightly from emotion and exhaustion. His mother, a practical woman who had survived her own share of hardships during the war years, looked at this strange patchwork creation and asked the obvious question, "From the enemy?" Her voice carried notes of confusion and perhaps suspicion, because in her mind the Americans and British had been the source of the bombs that destroyed her city, and how could anything good come from such a source? Hans could only nod, lacking the words to explain the complexity of what he had experienced, the strange paradox of being kept alive by the very people his country had tried to destroy, receiving warmth and care from hands that had every reason to close into fists instead. Years later, when Hans Keller had become an old man and those events in Texas had faded into the distant past of a different lifetime, he would sit with grandchildren on his lap and tell them stories about the war, though never the glorious kind of stories that soldiers sometimes told about courage and victory. Instead, he spoke about cold nights in a foreign land and blankets that were lighter than air but stronger than steel in their purpose. He would stroke the worn fibres of that old blanket, which he had kept all those decades, preserved carefully in a cedar chest and brought out only for special occasions like this, and he would whisper to the children in a voice that carried the weight of history and memory. "This is not just a blanket, you understand. This is the reason I am sitting here with you today, the reason you exist at all, because without this thin piece of cloth I might have frozen to death in Texas, and your mother would never have been born and you would never have come into the world. It is the most important object I own, not because of what it is, but because of what it represents, because it taught me that strength can be quiet, and that enemies can be generous, and that the world is more complicated than the simple stories we tell ourselves." Other former prisoners carried similar memories and similar objects back to Germany, each one embedding their own meaning into those thin American blankets. Some hid them away, reluctant to display anything that came from the country that had bombed their cities and defeated their armies, but unable to discard objects that had such personal significance. Others kept them in plain sight, using them on their beds or draping them over furniture, allowing the blankets to become part of their everyday domestic landscape, even if they never spoke about where these items had come from or what they represented. A few, in their old age, donated their blankets to museums or historical societies, wanting to ensure that these artifacts would be preserved as testimony to a specific moment in history when the line between enemy and savior had become blurred in ways that challenged easy categorization. The blankets ended up in collections alongside uniforms and weapons and propaganda posters, but they told a different kind of story. One less about violence and ideology and more about the stubborn persistence of human decency even in the midst of total war. The memory that stayed with many of these men, the image that haunted them in quiet moments, was the sight they had witnessed on that final day at the camp when they were preparing to leave for good. As the prisoners marched toward the train yard under guard, a gust of wind had caught a line of blankets that had been hung out to air after washing, and these thin shapes had lifted and fluttered in the breeze like white flags. The men who turned back for one last look at the camp that had been their home for months or years saw those blankets moving in the wind against the Texas sky, and the symbolism of that moment was impossible to miss. White flags had traditionally meant surrender, an admission of defeat and a plea for mercy, and in a sense that was exactly what these prisoners were carrying with them, both literally in their packs and figuratively in their hearts, an acknowledgement that they had been defeated not just militarily but ideologically, that their assumptions about superiority and inferiority had proven false, and that mercy had come from the most unexpected source. The blankets became, in the years that followed, a kind of secret society among those who had experienced this particular revelation, a shared reference point that needed no explanation among those who understood but could not easily be communicated to those who had not been there. When former prisoners met years later at reunions or chance encounters, they would sometimes mention the blankets in passing, and that mention would be enough to convey volumes of shared experience and understanding. A simple phrase like, "Do you remember those American blankets?" could trigger hours of conversation, revisiting not just the cold nights in Texas, but the entire process of having one's certainties shaken and one's worldview reconstructed. The thin cloth had been a catalyst for a transformation that went far beyond physical survival, forcing men to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and their society and the nature of strength and weakness. History, in its telling and retelling, tends to focus on the grand gestures and the dramatic moments, on the leaders who gave speeches and the battles that turned the tide of conflict. The thunder of artillery and the roar of aircraft engines dominate the narrative, while quieter stories get overlooked or forgotten. Yet sometimes it is exactly those quieter stories that carry the most profound truths about human nature and human society. A thin blanket passed from American hands to German prisoners might seem like a trivial detail in the vast scope of World War II, barely worth mentioning alongside the major battles and strategic decisions that determined the war's outcome. But for the men who experienced it, for those who shivered through those cold Texas nights and emerged with a new understanding of what they had been fighting for and what had been fighting against them, this small detail contained universes of meaning. The experience revealed something that propaganda and ideology had worked hard to conceal, that the enemy could be more humane than expected, that innovation could trump tradition, that abundance could be a form of strength rather than weakness, that mercy and practicality were not mutually exclusive, and that objects dismissed as worthless could prove more valuable than treasure. These lessons, learned through personal experience rather than accepted on faith or authority, had a power that no amount of re-education or political lecturing could match. The men who came home carrying those blankets in their packs had been transformed in ways that they themselves might not fully understand or be able to articulate, but the transformation was real and lasting nonetheless, shaping how they raised their children and how they thought about the world and how they remembered the years of war that had consumed their youth. Perhaps that is why such stories matter, even decades later, even in a world that has moved far beyond the specific circumstances of World War II and the Cold War that followed it. They serve as reminders that history is not just made of victories and defeats, of treaties signed and governments overthrown, but also of small human gestures that ripple outward through time in ways we cannot predict or control. An American soldier draping a blanket over a coughing German prisoner's shoulders, a family in Texas donating a handmade quilt to unknown captives, a quartermaster corps purchasing department ordering synthetic blankets by the hundreds of thousands, without knowing that each one would become a small battlefield in the war of ideas. These moments mattered because they demonstrated possibilities that contradicted the dominant narratives of both sides, showing that even total war could not completely eliminate human compassion or the recognition of shared vulnerability. The blankets spoke more eloquently than any propaganda broadcast about the true nature of American strength, revealing that it rested not just on industrial capacity or military might, but on a fundamental societal confidence that could afford to be generous even to defeated enemies. The prisoners who had initially mocked those blankets as evidence of American weakness and incompetence came to understand, through painful experience, that they had mistaken efficiency for flimsiness, innovation for inadequacy, and abundance for waste. The lesson was driven home not through words, but through the simple physical fact of warmth on a freezing night, through waking up alive when death had seemed like a real possibility, through the undeniable evidence of their own survival facilitated by objects they had scorned. In the final accounting, the story of those blankets at a prisoner of war camp in Texas during the winter of 1943 to 1944 encapsulates something essential about the human experience of war and captivity, something that transcends the specific historical moment and speaks to broader truths about how we understand ourselves and others. It demonstrates the danger of assumptions, the importance of keeping an open mind even about enemies, the way that pride can blind us to reality, and the possibility of learning through suffering and humiliation. It shows that strength can be quiet, and that weakness is not always what it appears to be, that technology and tradition can lead to different solutions for the same problems, and that sometimes the most important revelations come not from great speeches or dramatic events, but from small objects doing their simple jobs with unexpected effectiveness. The German prisoners who lived through those nights and carried those blankets home with them became witnesses to a truth that their ideology had tried to suppress. The truth that human beings are fundamentally similar in their needs and vulnerabilities, regardless of nationality or race, that survival often depends on cooperation and mutual care rather than domination and hierarchy, and that the line between superior and inferior is far less clear than political systems would have us believe. These men had been taught that they were inherently better than others, that their blood and soil and tradition made them naturally dominant, and then they found themselves dependent for their very lives on the industrial output and human decency of people they had been trained to despise. The contradiction was impossible to ignore or explain away, and it left permanent marks on those who experienced it directly. When these former prisoners eventually told their stories to historians or family members, when they tried to communicate what it had been like to go through that particular transformation, many of them came back to the same images and metaphors. They described the blankets as being lighter than air but heavier than stone, meaning that the physical weight was minimal, but the symbolic and emotional weight was enormous. They talked about how something so thin could create such effective barriers, both against the cold and against the prejudices they had carried with them. They spoke of white flags fluttering in the Texas wind, of small stitches made by children's hands, of American guards who showed no particular emotion while distributing objects that would save lives, of the strange feeling of owing your survival to an enemy's charity. All of these memories and images circled around the central paradox that in seeking to destroy their captors, they had made themselves dependent on those same captors for the most basic necessities of life, and that dependence had revealed truths they would have preferred to remain ignorant of. The lasting impact of this experience can be traced through the subsequent lives of many of these men, in the way they approached political questions after the war, in the skepticism they showed toward new forms of nationalism and authoritarianism, in their willingness to embrace democracy and reconciliation during the reconstruction of Germany. Men who had learned through bitter experience that their assumptions could be catastrophically wrong, that propaganda could be dangerously misleading, that enemies could be sources of survival rather than threats to existence. These men were less likely to accept simple narratives about national superiority or racial destiny. They had paid for their education in nights of cold and days of humiliation, and they were not about to forget the lessons easily. The blanket itself, that simple object of woven synthetic fibers, became a symbol that carried multiple meanings simultaneously. It was evidence of American industrial power, yes, but also of American humanness. It was proof of German miscalculation, certainly, but also of German adaptability and survival. It represented both defeat and salvation, both humiliation and grace, both the costs of war and the possibilities of peace. An object that could contain all of these contradictions and paradoxes was something special, something worth preserving and remembering and passing down to future generations who might draw their own lessons from it. And so the story persists, told and retold in various forms, appearing in memoirs and history books and now in retellings like this one, because it contains something that resonates beyond its specific historical circumstances. It reminds us that the objects we dismiss can save us, that the people we despise can show us mercy, that our certainties can be overturned by experience, and that sometimes the most important moments in history are not the ones with the loudest explosions, but the quiet ones where understanding dawns and perspectives shift, and human beings recognize their common humanity despite everything that divides them.